We're at our start time, and I'm going to go ahead and take care of the housekeeping while people are still coming in. Hello, and welcome to Open Classroom. My name is Tiffany Phillips, and I'm the Comms Director for the Brown School. Before we get into today's panel presentation, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. A reminder to everyone who's joining us on Zoom that this is webinar format, so we cannot see or hear the audience or call on raised hands, but chat is enabled. We encourage you to participate, to share your thoughts, to chat with each other, and make this as interactive as possible. Post your questions and comments at any time. We're going to have our Q&A at the end of the session. For those that are joining us on YouTube, we are not able to moderate comments and chat is disabled. We do encourage you to attend some upcoming events. On May 11th, we're going to present Crisis in Child and Youth Behavioral Health. What are the issues and what is our federal response? And on May 12th, we present Robotics, Artificial Intelligence, and Ethics. Both of those are going to take place at 12:30 Central Time. And you'll be able to find out about those and other things that are coming up on our website, and I will drop that link in chat. With that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Reena. You are Reena Hajat Carroll, who serves as Executive Director of California Conference for Equality and Justice. Reena, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're so excited to have you. As Tiffany shared, I'm Reena Hajat Carroll. I'm a proud graduate of 2005 from the Brown School. Certainly loved my WashU experience and am honored to be on the call with so many of my WashU friends and colleagues today. Thank you so much again to the Brown School for hosting this really important and critical conversation right now as we as a nation, as a community, really struggle with some of these key issues around Asian identity, around social justice and transformation. We're hoping that in the next hour, we get to have some very rich and real conversation about issues that matter to all of us, and really to do this in the spirit of learning and reflection. As we get started, I'd love to hear a little bit from our panelists. I'm going to ask Ed, Christina, and then Theresa to just introduce themselves, to tell us their names, where they're zooming in from, and then anything they'd like to share about their identity. And then after Theresa, we'll move to Chris, Kelley, and that will wrap it up for intros, and then we'll move into our questions. So Ed, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to be here, and happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. My name's Ed Tepporn. I currently serve as the Executive Director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, which is the primary nonprofit organization that works with California state parks to preserve the National Historic Landmark at Angel Island, where over 500,000 immigrants were processed and detained, particularly those from Asian and Pacific Islander countries from 1910 to 1940. I am a WashU undergraduate graduate. I also attended the Brown School of Social Work, and I identify as a gay Asian immigrant of Chinese and Thai descent.
Hi, everybody. My name is Christina Meneses. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am zooming in from my office in St. Louis right now. I moved to St. Louis 20-something years ago from the DC area for grad school, and I meant to be here 2 years, and then St. Louis did what St. Louis does, and here I am 20-something years later. I graduated with my MSW from the Brown School in '98 and have been teaching. One of my side hustles is teaching social justice and human diversity there for the last 11 years. And I identify as Filipino American.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to be here. My name is Theresa Kouo. I use she, her pronouns. I am calling in from Seattle, Washington. I'm a new resident of the Pacific Northwest. Before that, I was in St. Louis for 5 years and used to work at the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement at WashU. I'm currently a senior consultant with a small social impact consulting firm called Kinetic West, providing management consulting services to government, nonprofits, businesses, et cetera. And I'm excited to be here as someone who identifies as Vietnamese American, Asian American politically, and talk with you all today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Theresa, and we'll move to Christopher.
Yeah, good Good afternoon. Sorry, I had to look at my clock really quick. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Fan. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm calling in from St. Louis. I am currently one of the directors in the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at BJC Healthcare. My primary focuses are on language services and accessibility across BJC. I am a 2014 MSW and MPH graduate of the Brown School. And just like Christina, I'm not from the Midwest. I actually come from upstate New York, but St. Louis does what St. Louis does. I also am proud to have taught social justice and human diversity for the Brown School for a few years now. And it's a good way for me to stay connected to the Brown School. And then I identify as Asian American politically, but more or less, I would probably say I'm a proud Taiwanese American and Hakka.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelley Lou. I'm based in DC. I use she, her pronouns. I currently work at an organization called National CAPACD, which stands for the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development, where we focus on housing and economic justice issues that affect low-income Asian American Pacific Islander communities across the United States. I am a 2009 graduate from the Brown School, and I identify as a Chinese American 3.5 generation, also a proud Texan transplant as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Kelley. Thank you to all the panelists. Again, I'm Reena. I am originally from Chicago, moved to St. Louis, and it certainly did what it does to me too for about 13 years, and then recently relocated to Los Angeles, which is where I am zooming in from. So excited to be with you all. As some of you know who jumped on the call a few minutes early, we are a robust group. We have a lot to say. We are excited to jump in today. I don't think an hour is going to do justice for all that we can talk about. And certainly we all know that that's true. We have so much to cover, right? Everything from 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Vincent Chen, to COVID, to beyond, right? We have so much here. And so we're going to jump in right now with a question that is really sort of basic from one perspective, which is around the term Asian American. As you heard, we're all different types of Asian. I identify as Indian, American, and Asian, but we also know that in our experiences, our lived experiences, we have a lot of diversity. And so I want to ask the panel what they think about the term Asian American. And is this the term that we should be using to describe our group?
I can go ahead and jump in first, Reena. So at my organization, we actually really struggle with the term AAPI and what that means, especially recognizing that there's no Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander community members recognized on this panel currently. And so when we say APAM, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, what does that look like for other communities who aren't as represented on a lot of these panels and conversations? So as a organization, we've been having really intentional conversations with Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities about what would you want that title to look like in order to not tokenize these communities and just lump them together. And so, we've been hearing a lot of feedback about what if it was Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. And an example of this as well is the White House Initiative on Asian American Pacific Islanders used to be called WIAPI, and now it's called WIANAPI, which is to acknowledge the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities and to make that more centered in our title. And so, I'm sure a lot of us will talk about the political power that comes with lumping quote unquote AAPIs together, but there's just a lot of history and intentionality in terms of being more inclusive in our own movement as well.
If I can just add to what Kelley shared, I think for us, whatever term we use, it's more than just including some initials in the term. And it's about actively ensuring that our words, our actions, our foci are inclusive as well. I think one of the challenges is that we represent a diverse diaspora of 50 different ethnic groups that speak over 100 different languages and dialects. And so no one term will adequately describe the diversity that we all come from. And at the same time, there is the sense of critical mass where we know that policies and decisions are determined oftentimes by numbers. And so by aggregating our groups together, it gives us that sense of size of community, right? When our communities represent 25 million people here in the US, that is a voice of political power and advocacy power. And then the flip side of that is the importance of disaggregation. So when you aggregate all this data in charts, tables, and graphs and reports into just one category, whether it's Asian American Pacific Islander, or Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, it still doesn't get to the level of granularity and specificity where we can truly see the very real challenges that many subcommunities within our diaspora are experiencing.
I just want to add to that. I think also putting it in context is also helpful. So we know that the term Asian American historically comes out from, from the 60s, from UC Berkeley, right? So during the Third World Liberation Front, as well the Black Panther Party, there were some Asian students at the UC Berkeley who wanted to create a powerful protesting bloc similar to the Black Panther Party. And so they coined the term Asian Americans. And I think that is a very important thing to understand, that it is a very politically driven identity. That doesn't mean that there's not social identities with it and there's not other connections, but it is a political identity with power attached to it. But to Ed's point, I think what's also really important, whether we discuss if it's a good term or a bad term, and I don't really like that discussion, it is more of because we are so diverse within this political grouping, of if we are going to own this term and own this identity, are we centering everyone who falls under that, or are we falling into traps of centering a tribalistic view of we're centering Chinese people when we think about Asian Americans, or we're centering only people from the Asian continent and not our Pacific Islander siblings, or we never think about the Indian subcontinent ever when we talk Asian Americans. So I think that's the kind of the tension of that term once it when we think about political or social.
Thank you. And Chris, to that point, Kelley, I actually want to follow up with something you just said in terms of your recognition of the omission of Native Pacific Islanders and Hawaiian communities. Can you share a little bit personally about how you exposed yourself and got educated around those communities?
Sure. Thanks for asking that question. So at my work at National Capacity, this is a low-key flex, but I had the honor and privilege of actually going to travel to Hawaii as part of my job. And so we met with Native Hawaiian community leaders, and we asked them, what is it like to be lumped and kind of tokenized a lot of times in conversations where, you are the only one and you are asked to be representative of a way larger community, especially since Hawaii has been colonized in many ways. And for those communities, what they're really wanting and looking for is sovereignty. And so we actually did a research study with a group in Hawaii called Hawaiian Community Assets around a term we call empowerment economics. And we really asked them, what does it look like to center culture as a way of thinking about how you serve your community? And so they had a really rich, robust curriculum, and maybe I can share in the chat later, of how they center Native Hawaiian language and culture in how they serve their clients and think about building generational wealth as a way to tap into Native assets and the land and things that we wouldn't commonly think about on the mainland, other 50 or 49 states kind of thing. So I think that's a really rich opportunity that I realize not everyone gets, but specifically in the US, the Pacific Islander communities have been talking about how their communities have been affected by COVID at rates that are way higher than anyone else too. And so having conversations about what does health equity look like for these communities as well is really important in order to center these conversations as well. So hopefully that just gives you a little small snippet of things that we've been able to do.
Thank you so much. And Theresa, Christina, turning it to you to see if you have any final thoughts on this kind of catch-all term that we've all just sort of defined as being problematic, but anything else that we're missing in terms of the conversation of the label?
I'll speak from more of a social lens. I think one of the interesting and challenging things about being part of this kind of political lens and political category is there's also a lot of kind of pressure to associate yourself with lots of people who aren't like you at all, right? Like when I think of being Filipino, there are so many things that don't overlap with being Chinese or Taiwanese or Indian, right? And so on a social level, there's that tension and not feeling kind of enough Asian. And so even within the political sphere, the tension that's created of being one of those overlooked groups. And then I would say the other thing is it ignores the histories of the countries that we're from and the tensions between our countries and the histories there. And there's no space for that once we land in the United States, because we are now supposed to be part of this group, and there's no conversation around those things either.
Yeah, and I just want to, the only thing I would add to this part of the conversation is like really thinking about how it's personal, right? Like how people identify is very personal to them. And as we're talking about this massive label for a community, you know, I think about the choices that I make as an individual about when I share that I'm Asian American, I lead with that, or when I lead with being Vietnamese American. So for someone who worked in higher ed, it was very important for me, you know, Tran isn't legally my name anymore. I go by Kouo, my married name, but I put Tran in to signal to people that I am Vietnamese American, especially in a place like WashU, an elite higher ed institution where you're not seeing a lot of Vietnamese people. So it was important for me to be able to call that out so that students and other faculty and staff knew that we had some of this shared history together, and that we could be a place of safety to talk through what does it mean to be at an institution like this when you have these shared experiences.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for those different points. So in terms of talking about building community, Theresa, thank you so much for bringing that up. And Christina, this last point about not feeling enough Asian, right? Not being Asian enough. And so here we are not feeling Asian enough in this country that we live in, dealing with whiteness and white supremacy culture and other kind of bigger concepts that we have to deal with and kind of grapple with around what it means to be white adjacent or white aspiring. These are a couple of the terms that are kind of commonly coming up in language as we are trying to figure out the complexity of our identities. I'm curious if the panel can help us understand, what does it mean to be white adjacent? What does it mean to be white aspiring?
So this is the way I like to think about it for myself and the history of my family, and I think a lot of other Asians, is that white supremacy has cut and does cut a deal with Asians, right? And the deal is that in a lot of ways we will appreciate some of the Asianness that we like your food, right? And we will and we will kind of give you outcomes that on an aggregate level are really good in comparison and really close to white folks, right? And so when we look at a lot of data, and this is something I remember being always, but particularly in the Brown School, whenever anything was disaggregated by race, always looking and seeing this consistent pattern that Asians and white folks typically were on the same level, and then other Black and brown folks were not, right? And so that's kind of a sweet deal for Asians. And so Asians benefit from that, and white supremacy benefits because white supremacy gets to say, see, racism doesn't exist because Asians are doing great, right? And then the way that white supremacy uses Asians, AAPI folks, as a wedge, right, to hold down other Black and brown folks. And then the way that our communities internalize that, right? The way that my parents have internalized that and have kind of separated me from other Black and brown communities when I was growing up, because they were concerned about schooling and education and all of these things. And then what was the impact of that on my relationships and my abilities? And then what was the impact of that on other Black and brown folks and their ability to trust me and to see me as part of a group that was fighting for them? So those are a lot of the things that I think about when I think about this role that Asian AAPI folks are put in.
Yeah. I think to be a little bit more nuanced, Christine, I think what I also think about with this idea of white adjacency, white aspiring and things like that is the who within Asian America is even allowed to claim white adjacency, even if they so choose to want it or not want it, right? And so like, I remember on the, we as panelists were chatting as preparation, and I'm just like, I like to throw history facts out. And I think it's also really important to contextualize the idea that many of the groupings or ethnic groups within Asian America that have been maybe allowed to tiptoe into white adjacency, a lot of it is historically based on which people were allowed to immigrate into the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and all the subsequent restrictions of Asian immigration to the United States. You know, my parents would fall into that stereotypical category. They were high degree holders who were allowed to come to the United States to get their PhDs. And so if you allow kind of the big four, right? We understand the big four as kind of Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Taiwanese at that kind of point of time. You start bringing in people who are master's level, PhD level people coming in, the aggregate will show that they will do well, right? And what you do is you don't disaggregate, so you don't see what's happening to Vietnamese refugees, what's happening to Cambodian and Lao refugees, what's happening to all these other refugee groups. And all of a sudden it does look like all of a sudden Asians are doing just as well, if not better than whites. So what do they have to complain about? I also love this idea of we're a wedge issue, right? We are the ones who are going, you know, we are being seen as the ones who are going to take down affirmative action. We are the wedge issue in many poor areas. I mean, LA is one of the biggest historical areas to think about where Asians became a wedge issue between white and black. And you can see it across the United States in historical senses. And so I just wanted to give that little nuance of like, even the white adjacency and white aspiring is only allowed for a certain minute group of people who would fall under Asian America.
I just wanted to give a personal context too. My family grew up in the South during a time of racial segregation in the 50s. And I often had a question with my mom of like, you know, when they had like signs like whites only, I asked her like water fountains, like which water fountain did you use? And, you know, growing up in Texas, she's like, well, I use the white one. I was like, well, you're not white, you know? And I think that many of us thought in order to assimilate that, you know, we're seen as white and that's good enough for us. And so we will forego our history, our language, our culture, the things that make us unique and who we are in order to assimilate, to not be subjected to being in the colored or other categories. And so what does that lead to in terms of generational conversation about anti-Blackness in a lot of our families? Like, it's really hard to have conversations with family members who have worked so hard to aspire to be white, to think about how these racial issues and the civil rights movement impact us today and how we've benefited from a lot of those policies and laws because of, you know, our Black and brown brothers and sisters who really led and paved the way. So.
Thank you, Kelley. Before we get to that, because I want to dig into this point a little bit more around anti-Blackness and our Asian community. But before we do that, just turning it to Ed and Theresa about this concept of white aspiring. And if that is a term that personally resonates with you, and if you have a preference between that or white adjacency, or even just this bigger concept of the model minority.
Theresa, would you like to go first, or would you like me to? Okay, I think for me, I grew up in Texas as well, and I had a very early childhood experience in 4th grade where we went to an outdoor education camp in school. And as soon as all the schools arrived at that camp, we assembled on the baseball fields and they started calling out dorm assignments. And this was 1983, 1984. They called all the students of color and placed them in one set of dorms, and all the white students and placed them in another set of dorms. And so I learned from an early on that I was not white. And I think that for many of us in the Asian community, I don't know if it's necessarily white aspiring, but it's exactly what Christopher and Kelley have said. It's trying to escape from racism, from xenophobia. And so trying to take on the aspects or alignment with whichever majority group is in power. And I do want to acknowledge too that, I mean, again, we're a diverse community. And so I think it's very true that there are aspects and segments of our community who potentially identify more with the majority white community, but there are also segments of our community who have walked lockstep hand in hand with our brothers and sisters in the Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latinx, Latina, and Latinx communities, with Jewish communities, with differently abled and with LGBT communities. And so it's hard to clump all of our communities into one stereotype of whether they aspire to be white adjacent or not. I also think a lot of times what happens is when we are in racial equity conversations or diversity, equity, inclusion conversations, we are automatically pegged as an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community as having more privilege than our brothers and sisters in other racial ethnic minority communities. And so I think that is a dangerous stereotype sometimes, in that, yes, there's absolutely privileges that we have as being Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, but by doing that, it also erases the very real injustices and inequities that our communities endure, especially when you aggregate our education data, our health data, our economic data into this lump Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander term. And that all contributes to what you talked about, Reena, in terms of this perception of us being a model minority where we're all universally well-educated and wealthy. And that's just not true, despite movies like Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah, I don't live that crazy rich Asian life. So I think it's important to maybe think about it as, whiteness and white supremacy, and then the responsibility that we have as a community that is being used as a wedge to do the work of combating white supremacy and addressing the anti-Blackness in our communities. I think it's a really difficult and challenging place to be, because you're sort of like in between these spaces of like hearing these stories, being in deep relationship with people, and needing to be that voice that sort of calls it out and names it for others to see. So I would just say that I think we all have a personal responsibility, whether or not we're benefiting from whiteness and white supremacy, or like being complicit in anti-Blackness, to like call it out, name it, and do something about it.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
just want to, Reena, if I could just add one thing, it just popped in mind. I just want to be able to say it before I forget it. I also think this idea of kind of this white adjacency, or just like the effects of it, going back to white supremacy and whiteness, is that it's an excellent tool, right, to offer white adjacency to basically erase trauma, to basically erase a traumatic history, right? I will be honest, growing up, I knew nothing about my own I knew nothing about Asian American history. It was never taught. It was never given to me. And so you have this idea that you don't have to Ed's point, you don't have a shared struggle with Black and brown people. It's, you showed up somehow, and then you can do all these things within a limit, but it's much better than everyone else. And then, what this white adjacency does is it does not allow you to start looking into, well, oh my God, the amount of refugees the United States created in Asia, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the amount of racial profiling, the amount of murder, like Vincent Chin's murder is one of the things that never gets talked about. And all these things, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, we really do have much more shared in common with Black and brown people. And can you imagine what that political bloc would look like if you actually were able to unite at the time, right, in LA, if you were to actually unite Koreans and Black people at the time in the early 90s.
Thank you, Chris. Loving all the history plugs that you're doing today. And I want to take this conversation, though, and explore a little bit further about some conversations that we're starting to have about our own lived experiences and maybe some of the generational changes that we're hoping to see or that we are seeing. So if we go back, Christina, to your comment around how your grandparents separated you from non-Asian folks, right? I know for me personally, that was certainly an experience, right? It was great to be friends with other Asians. It was better to be friends with Asians and white kids over the Latinx and Black kids, right, in my neighborhood. And that was something that was certainly implicit, But then there were some things that were also very explicit around language, around food, right? So my parents spoke Hindi and Gujarati to each other, but they didn't teach my sisters or I, right? Why was that? That was because we were in the country and we were there to assimilate. So there is some unlearning, right? And some processing that I have to do now as an adult with my own children that is related to this need to assimilate and to be white adjacent, right? Because 40 years ago, or even longer when my parents immigrated, this was a different time. It was a different context. And so I'm curious if we can get into a conversation a little bit about what is changing and what's our role in that. So Theresa, you kind of started us off by saying we have to name it, right? We have to name where either our fragility is coming up, where we're seeing power and privilege work in ways that maybe we're a little uncomfortable with because the way we were raised was to say, hey, that's not our issue. That's the Black issue. That's the Latinx issue, right? We're the good Asians. We're the model minority. We don't do what you're told, right? And so, of course, that's really overgeneralizing all of our experiences. But in terms of what are we unlearning right now and what can we do to strengthen future generations? Those are the couple questions I'm going to leave you with. And I see in the chat that question is coming up too about what's changing. Kelley, can I toss it to you to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak from a personal experience. Something else that's obviously significant about May is it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and I feel like that's an issue that doesn't get talked about a lot in Asian American households. And shameless plug, but I have a friend who actually just released a book from the Asian American Mental Health Collaborative called Permission to Come Home. And just what does it look like to talk about mental health issues within an Asian American household and not to push it under the rug. And I think with the rise of anti-Asian violence, with a lot of what we're seeing in our country as a whole, like I can speak personally, like my mental health really deteriorated during this time and it was really hard. And I think that that's something that I am encouraged that this next generation is really looking to, one, destigmatize, but two, also like talk about more openly and to say it's okay, you know. And I think that that's how we change the generations that go after us as well, to be able to, you know, I'm sure a lot of us entered this profession because we wanted to make a difference in people's lives who have felt isolated, who have been struggling. And I think that that's what's so critical about, you know, the Brown School and other social work programs is seeing faces like this. And you know, speaking from my own personal experience, like I didn't see a lot of Asian American social workers. And that was hard for me. Like, do I belong in this profession? Is there a place for me? Like my parents wanted me to be in the healthcare profession. So what does it look like to buck that norm and to do something that's probably not going to be as lucrative in some ways, but just as much meaningful and empowering for future communities? And so I'm personally inspired when I get, you know, social work MSW students who are like really impassioned and have a really strong sense of what they want to do with their career. And I think that that is how we begin to continue to make, you know, strides in our movement as well.
I can speak. With the uprisings that really took hold in St. Louis around the murder of Mike Brown, group was formed in St. Louis, APIs for Black Lives. And it was really intentional as Asian activists who were on the ground were trying to figure out, like, we want to be present and we also want to be real clear that at this moment we are not centering kind of the needs of Asians, but the idea of Asians being in solidarity with Black folks. And so we had some really important conversations internally that I hadn't been having with other Asians in town, which was really great. Another thing that was coming up was just kind of the efforts that we were making, and we were reaching out to a lot of younger students and who were in college and graduate school, and there was a real strong interest in this conversation in St. Louis. And because the numbers of Asians and AAPI folks in St. Louis is so small relative to some of the other places where you all are zooming in from, like there was this St. Louis is such a black and white town in the way that it thinks of itself. And so the first conversation we wanted to have was we really wanted a representation of white folks, black folks, and Asians all in the same room together, so we could put this whole wedge piece on the table and acknowledge what was happening. And through that process, one of the things that we realized was some of the work that we had to do was actually within our own families. And so a couple of pieces that I just want to name. One of them is that there was a theme that was coming out from about many of our parents who came as immigrants, and part of their challenge with engaging in the conversation around anti-Blackness was the way that they understood their lives. They had made so many sacrifices to come to the United States and to find a better life. And they needed the United States to be a good country, because otherwise it challenged the idea of, was it worth it to leave behind friends, family, homes, history? Right? And so that was a really interesting thing to unpack that I hadn't been thinking of, that came up in the conversations. And then lastly, around that time, around the country, and I don't actually know where this originated, but a Google Doc was started, and it was specifically from Asians to our Asian families about why we care about anti-Blackness and why we wanted them to be part of this conversation. And there was this amazing crowdsourcing effort to have that translated into as many Asian AAPI languages as possible, which I thought was a really interesting kind of acknowledgement of the work that we could do and what some of the potential was.
If I can also add in, I lived in St. Louis from 1991 till about 2000. And as a gay Asian, as a gay person, I never felt like I fully fit in the Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. And as an Asian man, I didn't feel like I was fully embraced by the LGBTQ community. And my hope is that that has changed some over the decades since I've lived in St. Louis. But I've definitely seen it in different places around the world where there are now LGBTQ contingents in the Chinese New Year's parades and Lunar New Year parades in different cities. I've seen it in my own family, where when I initially had that coming out conversation with my parents, they threatened to disown me. And 5 years ago, when my husband and I went to visit my parents back in Thailand, they put us in a room with only one bed. And so I do hope that with each generation, there is this increased opportunity for us to think about how we are more inclusive, to understand the full breadth of diversity within our communities, because it's not just the countries of origins that make us diverse. It's our socioeconomic status, it's our immigration status, it's our gender, our different levels of ability, our orientations, what have you. And the more that we take the opportunity to just be more aware that these different elements of identity exist, and let alone the folks who identify as multiracial, right? That is one of the fastest growing segments of our Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. And it is the reality of the future that we are becoming a more increasingly multiracial society. So those are the opportunities for us now to be more aware that these diversities exist, and to lean into our curiosities about the different journeys that each of us travel.
Yeah. What I love about what Ed, Christina, and Kelley said, and I'm finding this little through line, is I think one of the things that we can start doing is really starting to think about what belonging looks like now. You know, I think a lot of us, whoever our original ancestor was, who came to this country, you know, they underwent a lot of trauma. They had to really kind of give up a lot of who they were. They had to really erase a lot of identities, and they experienced trauma the moment they stepped off, and every moment they had through, whether they're living now or whether they passed, they bore trauma. And we know that generational trauma is very real. We know it's very real in Asian American communities. And I think for us, one of the things that we can very much think about is, what does belonging look like, and what does healing and reconciliation look like within our own communities, right? Are we, you know, to Kelley's point, are we doing our own work of healing the harm we've undergone or that we've experienced from our own families? Are we willing to step in and be brave and start healing and reconciling with our own communities? And are we willing to really look at how intersectional we are with our identities and saying everyone deserves to have a place here under this umbrella of Asian America, whether or not we all embrace it fully or not, the idea that we are given the term, can we make it an inclusive and a place where everyone feels like they belong?
There for a second. Go ahead, Theresa, and then I'll go back to Chris.
I was going to say, I think the thing that I'm really excited about and the change that I see happening is also around like the number of Asian Americans we are electing to state legislatures and at federal levels as well. I spent the majority of my life in the state of Michigan, where Asian Americans were pretty small, and it was around Detroit, where it was very much a Black-white conversation, but was a part of a community that helped to establish a legislative caucus for Asian Americans, elect some of the first Asian American women to the legislature. And these are now individuals who are passing legislation to teach Asian American studies, but also doing that in conjunction with other communities to teach Latinx, Native, Indigenous, and Caribbean histories in the state. And so I think that there's a lot of momentum and opportunity to also think about how do we support those in our community who have this critical analysis about race and multiracial organizing to be in these places to really affect structural and policy changes.
Thank you. And that is actually just a really great segue going back to what Chris was talking about in terms of belonging and inclusivity. But Theresa, to your point about how are we standing up? And I want to get to a question in the chat about why are people not speaking up? So those that might be in our community, what do we think is the barrier for why folks aren't standing up? They're not naming issues. They're not calling folks in. What is it that's happening in terms of the barrier? And then, though, more importantly, what can they do to find a voice? So, and I'll just share briefly before I turn it over to you all, this conversation about how St. Louis is so Black and white was certainly something that was my experience living there for 13 years. And on a daily basis, going through the code switching, right? Because certainly my hair is like white people's hair, so maybe I could be white, my skin is brown, and right, had experiences on both sides. But now that I'm removed from St. Louis and feeling like I can actually just be me and it's okay, I don't have to fit into either of those communities, is mentally so relieving, right? And so that I think is such a critical point, especially for our folks that are in St. Louis that are dealing with this, right? In terms of where do they belong and how can they fully just show up as themselves and not have to continually play. So related to that question though, I want to go back to this, how do people stand up? How do they find their voice?
I think it can be frightening to find your voice. I know for myself, and I think this is true for a lot of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander cultures, we're taught from an early age to respect authority, to not cause waves, to not make a stink. And that in the way that decisions get made in this country doesn't necessarily work for us. There is this importance of advocating. There is this importance about talking about the very real injustices and challenges that our communities face, and not necessarily embracing this concept of saving face, where we try to hide all of our imperfections that we strive to be perfect A++ students. And so I think it's a personal choice for any of us, regardless of how long we've lived in the US or where we were born, to what degree we decide to hold on to those Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander cultures and traditions and norms, and to what degree we potentially assimilate to more American ways of thinking. But I do believe, as someone who worked in the HIV field for over 20 years, we learned in the HIV/AIDS movement that silence equals death. And I have definitely been inspired over the past 2 years by my siblings in the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, as we've seen these increasing attacks, over 10,000 attacks that are reported, and who knows how many more that are unreported, of racism and xenophobia, that our communities are finding our voice and we're speaking out against these atrocities. that are happening to our community, as well as what's happening to our fellow community, other communities that are experiencing racism, marginalization, and oppression.
Thank you so much, Ed, especially for bringing us back to this point about our cultural norms can sometimes, of course, be those barriers in terms of respecting authority, not always maybe knowing exactly what to say, how to say it. And so then I want to go back to the panel. And Christina, I know you work with young people. Is there anything you're seeing from a generational lens that's changing?
So I think just in terms of finding your voice, so I'm going to come from like my own personal journey, right? And so my experience of being Asian is being so marginalized, right? And like this idea that I could be accepted into spaces in where kind of my Asianness was off the table, right? And so that's how unless I was at home with my family. And then that was when I was allowed kind of to be Filipino. And like growing up and realizing like the ways in which that marginalization hurt me, but then also always comparing it against, but it's not as bad for me as it was for other Black and brown folks, right? So feeling like I couldn't complain, like it was like taking space from somebody else, right? In order to name the things that I didn't like that were happening to me because I was Asian, has been a real challenge. And figuring out how that conversation is actually a really helpful conversation to have and to name and to, again, point light at the wedge idea, the model minority idea, and to allow myself to be human. I think I've done a few caucus groups in my work at NCCJ, where I do trainings on diversity and equity. And I've done some caucus groups for folks who are neither Black nor white. And what often comes up is that when given the opportunity to actually just among ourselves talk about the things that happen to us that we don't like, there is a lot of like pain and hurt and resentment that needs to kind of come out first among us, knowing that we're not going to be judging each other for that before we can then move on to, okay, and what does our work look like in terms of allyship, right? And so I feel like in a weird, complicated psychology of it, that we need space to just say those things out loud before we can move into the places of support and connection. I should have said that's what I needed.
So I'll speak for myself as well. I think from my own personal experience, what makes this difficult, even though like I'm probably, if people know me, I'm not one to shy away from saying things out loud. But I think growing up, I think a lot of it came with the exhaustion of being hyper visible and hyper invisible simultaneously in the United States, where everyone knew I was Asian but cared nothing about my experience. And there's a huge exhaustion and trauma to that of being like, what's the point, right? What's the point of bringing anything up if I'm not part of a national conversation? I'm not part of a local conversation. You know, what's the point of that? And I think the other part, and this is my own experience, is I was very protective of my parents and my family, right? Why would I want to bring unnecessary, more visibility onto my parents and some of the things that they've had to endure living in a very small town in upstate New York where we were the only Asian family, right? Like, do I really want people to start harassing my parents at work because like, do you know what your son Christopher said at school, right? Like, do you know what he's been trying to rock the boat? So I think there was also that idea of like, the things that my parents went through, I'm not going to ask them to endure like my mouth and the consequences that come from that. And I think that's going back to Ed's point, I think that's the struggle of, at least for me, having grown up in a Taiwanese and a Chinese culture, that there's a very Confucian there's a deep Confucian foundation of like, you don't dishonor your family under any condition. And it's like, well, how do you do that? Well, you shut up. And so, but what I will say about the younger generations, what I really appreciate, tying into what Theresa said, I think the representation is helping people unlock that bravery and saying like, there are people like me who are speaking, and there are a lot of people who look like me and who want to connect with me. The histories are coming out a lot more. People are studying it. And I think that's helping people make those connections with like, this is no longer the it's okay and endure it until the next generation, because we are that next generation that can no longer stand for this.
Yeah, and I think that consciousness is really important in helping us to like see things that maybe we didn't see before, right? I think about in my personal experience in building like deep relationships with Black and Brown folks. And then when I'm in spaces where they are not at the table and I start to hear things and notice things, and I'm like, am I crazy? Is this happening? Like, to be able to now know that that's like happening, that it's racism that's happening. And to be able to use my positionality and be there and also be a messenger that can be heard in a way that others cannot. Just having the bravery to like name those things and call those out and invite others into conversation about like why those things are problematic. I think that that's a really important thing with all of the representation and more education happening across our community.
And I'm wondering, just for our audience, especially maybe those of you who are DEI trainers who do quite a bit of facilitation, if we can explore Theresa's point just a little bit and talk about what are some of those ways that we can call people in, that we can say, is this really happening? And maybe we should stop being so racist right now, right? What are some of the phrases that you've gone to? What have you said to change course of a conversation? And really, I think at the end of the day, to hold people accountable, right, to being better and to doing better. So can you share just with the audience what some strategies and tips you've used are?
I'll say that in my work, when we have conversations about race, I actually, in many ways, see my Asianness as a superpower because of the ways that people assume that I am closer to white and I am less threatening. Right? The ways that I can name racism as it's happening and the histories. And also, frankly, because I don't have the same levels of trauma as other people of color in the space, that I can say those things in a way that white people can hear, which is not necessarily always true for other folks of color in this space. So I will lean into, it's probably going to be more palatable coming from me, for you to hear that. And then I'd like to open up the space for other folks of color to say the other things that they need to hear.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Do you want to jump in with any tips, strategies, anything that's worked for you in those conversations?
Sure. I think some of the things that I often fall back on is just calling attention to the unconscious biases or the narratives, stereotypes, perceptions about our communities that might be present in the discussion. So we've already talked about the model minority myth. We've talked about the history of whitewashing Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander experiences. This universal concept of being treated as an other is something that I think we share with many other marginalized communities. And then the final one is this piece about being a perpetual foreigner, where regardless of how long we or our families or communities have lived here in the US, we're not seen as being fully American, or we're seen as perpetually being someone who's unwelcome in the country. And then one final narrative is related to gender roles, which is not something that we've talked about as much on today's call, but I think there are very specific gender stereotypes that exist where Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander females get hypersexualized in a lot of media and entertainment, and then Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander males get demasculinated. And so that has very real world implications for policy decisions, for the violence that happens against our communities. And so by calling forth those stereotypes, just to make people a little bit more aware that they might be circulating, they might be the white elephant in the room.
And on that note, we only have a couple minutes left. I want to kind of continue this thread of what we're doing, what we're not doing, and ask all the panelists to respond to this one last question around if you had the chance to ask members of our audience to make sure to stop doing one thing and start doing one thing, what would that be? And this is where we get to be really real and authentic and do the podcast we were talking about, right? Because we've had a really, really important and rich conversation today. But again, when we think about takeaways, we need to be real, right? With people, what do they need to stop doing and what do they need to start doing? And that includes ourselves, right? We're not exempt from this.
I'll jump in first, Reena, if that's okay. I'm actually wearing a shirt that says, love our people like you love our food. And I think, Christina, you were saying that earlier, like, there is so much of a notion of like, I like Chinese, like I literally had friends tell me like, I like this food but not care about my history or my family's upbringing. And so I wrote a whole article about this actually. And I think it goes beyond just folks who don't identify as Asian American or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Do we know our own history? Like, if you identify as that, like, do you actually know your own history too? And so I think spending time understanding our history, because it's not taught, right? We have to actively seek it out in books or in media, but also to not generalize that. If you read a book about someone, that doesn't mean that that's everyone's lived experience. So what does it look like to put on our social work hat and to think about, meeting people where they are, like asking them questions. I know someone mentioned in the chat about adoptees. I'm actually married to someone who is a Japanese adoptee too. And so he says, I identify differently depending on how people see me and what's convenient, because his last name is not Asian American. And so people see him and they're super confused, and he has the ability to code switch in many ways. And so understanding that people's stories are nuanced, that it's not just everyone's history is the same. And I think that would make great strides in just conversations. I think similarly, if you're identify as Asian American, it's having friends outside of your culture to share about your culture and to learn about someone else's culture, because I think the flip side of things that can be dangerous is when we're super internally focused and we just think about our own communities and we don't see other community struggles as well.
Thanks, Kelley.
More than one thing, yeah.
No, just thinking about your shirt and your comments there, and curious if we can also ask the audience when they ask us, what's the best Chinese food restaurant? What's the best Indian food restaurant? If we can say, you should Google it. Is that an acceptable response? Because maybe it's not on us to answer that question. So moving on, Chris and then Theresa, could you all share just final thoughts about what people should start doing and stop doing?
Yeah, so I'll do a 1-in-1. So I'll say for those who don't identify as Asian American, I would say, I would really ask you to start leaning into our history. PBS has a fantastic 5-part series right now that you can watch for free on PBS. It's a way to start getting to know kind of beyond what you see, or probably beyond what you don't see ever. But it'll give you a good sense of kind of a good overview of kind of a history that you may have never been taught. I would say internally, the one thing that I would ask everyone to start doing if you identify as Asian American, and I want to thank Ed for this, is I really want you to think about the intersectionalities of identities across Asian America, and how are we perpetuating parts of the violence of whiteness that has taught what we learned through the violence of whiteness, and how we exclude and harm our own Asian American siblings based on other identity groups that they share. So I'd really ask our Asian American siblings to really think deeply about, what are the pieces of supremacy that we tend to practice and we tend to use on an everyday to our own social groups.
And the rest of the panelists to put in the chat any final thoughts they have. We know that we need to all go buy Kelley's shirt. We know we can tune into PBS. We have lots of really good reports and data out there that Ed is more than happy to help us with. Christina is always available as a resource, as a trainer and a facilitator. And Theresa, same thing there, has so much knowledge. So our panelists, of course, are a great resource to continue this conversation. And we just want to thank you all so much. I want to thank the panelists for all of their just intentionality today, their authenticity, and all the wisdom they shared. Thank you all so much. Tiffany, I'm going to turn it back to you as we close out our conversation today.
Reena, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. This has been an amazing conversation. It's informative, it's been thoughtful, it's been frank in a way that I really appreciate, because sometimes you come into spaces and it's not clear whether or not you can bring your full authentic self. I love that you all brought that, and I think that the people that were interacting in chat appreciated it and brought their full selves as well. Thank everybody who was able to join us today. We will be listing this on our Open Classroom platform over on YouTube. And wow, we'll also share the resources that our panelists gave us. Thank you again so much. This has been amazing. And I will also be checking out that series. So they're going to get a lot of viewership from you guys.